There's a moment in every relationship dynamic where the energy shifts, quietly, subtly, and often without warning. It's the moment when the person who always cared, always forgave, always understood, finally reaches the point where their silence speaks louder than their love ever did. And in the case of a super empath and an avoidant, this moment is more than a turning point. It's the earthquake that shakes the avoidant awake. Because the super empath doesn't walk away in anger. They don't slam doors, they don't scream, they don't launch accusations. They simply withdraw the emotional power they were pouring into a connection that didn't know how to receive it. Their goodbye isn't loud, it's clean, it's full of dignity, and it's final in a way that pierces deeper than any argument. See, the avoidant spends so much time running from closeness, dodging vulnerability, convincing themselves that they're fine alone, that they fail to realize something crucial. They only feel safe avoiding love because someone is standing there, patiently loving them. And when that person disappears, the avoidant's entire emotional strategy collapses. They don't fall apart because the empath punished them. No, they fall apart because for the first time, they taste the reality of what it means to lose someone who kept showing up even when they didn't. They fall apart because silence removes the illusion of control. They fall apart because distance reveals the depth of what they took for granted. But here's the part nobody tells you. The super empath's walk away isn't about revenge. It's about self-respect. It's about finally choosing peace over potential. It's about recognizing that compassion doesn't mean self-sacrifice, and that loving someone who is afraid of love is not a lifelong assignment. And ironically, it's the precise moment the empath heals that the avoidant finally feels. Because loss has a way of breaking open what fear once kept locked. Because absence forces reflection that presence never could. And because the end of the empath's giving is the beginning of the avoidance awakening. If you are the super empath, know this. Your strength is not in how long you stayed. It's in the courage it took to leave. And if you are the avoidant, understand this. Your fear may protect you from pain, but it also protects you from love. At some point, you must decide which one you're willing to live without when. A super empath reaches the point where their goodbye becomes silent. It marks a shift that is far more powerful than any heated argument or emotional outburst could ever create. Silence in this context isn't emptiness. It is meaning, it is clarity, and it is the final testament of someone who has loved deeply but has finally understood their worth. For a long time, the super empath communicates with patience. They explain, they forgive, they try again and again and again. They believe in the potential of the connection. They believe the avoidant will eventually feel safe enough to show up. They hope consistency and compassion will melt the fear that keeps the avoidant distant. But what they learn, slowly, is that love alone cannot carry a relationship where one person refuses to step forward. The silent goodbye comes only after repeated attempts to bridge an emotional gap that never closed. And because the empath is emotionally intelligent, they don't explode. They don't resort to insults or blame. Instead, they withdraw their energy with precision. It's the kind of silence that has weight. It's the kind of silence that feels like a door gently closing in a quiet room. And it is precisely that gentleness that makes it so devastating. Arguments allow for defense. Accusations allow for excuses. Emotional explosions give the avoidant something to react to, something they can label as too much, something they can use to justify their distancing. But silence removes all those exits. There is nothing to counter, nothing to escape from, nothing to blame. There is only the absence of the person who once held the relationship together. What makes this silence so impactful is that the empath doesn't leave to be dramatic. They leave because they are done negotiating for emotional crumbs. They leave because their spirit is tired. They leave because they finally see that staying is slowly draining them. And when an empath is done, they don't need to make a scene. Their absence becomes the statement. Their peace becomes the answer. Their silence becomes the closure. For the avoidant, this moment is disorienting. They were used to the empath's constant emotional availability, the reassurance, the softness, the unconditional presence. They never believed the empath would truly leave because the empath always stayed. But when silence replaces the familiar warmth, The avoidant suddenly confronts the reality of what they've lost. They notice the missing check-in messages. They notice the stillness where reassurance used to be. They notice that there is no longer someone absorbing their fears and making sense of their emotional chaos. The lack of drama only amplifies the impact. Silence forces reflection. It forces accountability. It forces the avoidant to sit with emotions they've avoided for years: fear, regret, longing, confusion, and sometimes even grief. The empath's silent goodbye becomes the avoidant's loudest wake-up call. It's the moment they realize that love won't always wait, that patience isn't infinite, and that someone who gives wholeheartedly can also choose to walk away wholeheartedly. The silent goodbye is not just an ending, it is a revelation, one that echoes long after the empath has gone. Avoidants often move through relationships with a sense of emotional distance, a kind of internal shield that convinces them they are safer when they stay detached. They may crave connection on a deep level, but the fear of vulnerability, the fear of being seen, needed, or emotionally exposed, pushes them to retreat the moment things start to feel intimate. This pattern works for them as long as the other person keeps showing up. And in the dynamic between an avoidant and a super empath, the empath becomes that emotional anchor, the steady source of reassurance that allows the avoidant to maintain distance without ever feeling truly alone. The avoidant's entire strategy is unconsciously built on the assumption that the empath will always be there to soften their withdrawal. But when the empath finally walks away, that assumption collapses. The emotional safety net that made the avoidant feel secure enough to avoid closeness is suddenly gone. There is no patient voice reminding them that they are loved, no understanding tone soothing their fears, no gentle presence waiting for them to open up at their own pace. Without that emotional foundation, the avoidance coping mechanisms are exposed for what they really are: defensive walls that protect them from vulnerability, but also isolate them from genuine connection. And the moment those walls stand without support, the avoidant begins to feel the consequences of their own distance. This collapse doesn't always happen dramatically. It might begin with a subtle sense of discomfort, a quiet awareness that something feels different. At first, the avoidant may not even identify it as loss. They may simply feel unsettled, restless, or strangely off balance. But as time passes, the absence of the empath's emotional presence becomes impossible to ignore. The avoidant begins to recognize the gaps. No one is reaching out first. No one is checking if they're okay. No one is carrying the weight of the connection anymore. And that realization hits harder than any confrontation ever could. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant feels the emotional space where the empath used to be. They feel the silence that once felt comforting now turning into something cold and unfamiliar. They feel the loss of the person who made emotional intimacy feel safe enough to dip into. And without that safety net, the avoidant is forced to face the emotions they've spent years outrunning. Fear becomes sharper. Loneliness becomes louder. Regret starts creeping in around the edges. And beneath all of it, the avoidant faces a truth they have long denied. Distance doesn't prevent heartbreak. It only delays it. What makes this collapse so powerful is that it comes from within. It isn't triggered by an argument or a dramatic exit. It is triggered by the avoidant realizing that they were never as self-sufficient as they pretended to be. The person they took for granted was the very person who made their emotional avoidance feel manageable. Without the empath, the avoidant feels unmoored, disconnected not just from the relationship, but from themselves. Their defenses, once a source of comfort, begin to feel like cages. And in this internal unraveling, the avoidant is faced with a choice: continue clinging to the old patterns that cost them the connection, or confront the fears that kept them from embracing it. The moment the super empath walks away is the moment the avoidant finally sees the emotional reality they've been hiding from, a reality that forces them to acknowledge what they lost, what they pushed away, and what they were too afraid to let themselves have. A super empath doesn't walk away to punish someone or make a statement. They walk away because they have finally reached the point where their emotional well-being must come first. For so long, they invest deeply, they give. Their patience, their understanding, and their emotional presence without keeping score. They hold space for the avoidant's fears, hesitations, and emotional distance. They justify the moments of withdrawal, try to understand the silence, and forgive the hot and cold dynamic because they believe there is something worth fighting for. But compassion, no matter how powerful, has limits. And when the empath hits that invisible threshold, the shift is unmistakable. Their goodbye is calm, it is composed, it is delivered without resentment or drama, yet it carries a finality that no angry confrontation could ever achieve. The empath's decision to leave is rooted in self-respect. It's not that they suddenly stop caring, it's that they can no longer remain in a space where their needs are dismissed or minimized. They realize that love shouldn't feel like a constant test of endurance. It shouldn't demand they shrink themselves to keep the peace or hide their emotional depth to avoid overwhelming someone who refuses to meet them in the middle. The empath walks away because they understand that staying in a one-sided emotional dynamic slowly erodes their spirit. It drains their energy and distorts their sense of self-worth. And the moment they choose themselves is the moment they reclaim their power. What makes their exit so remarkable is the absence of anger. The empath doesn't leave in frustration. They leave with clarity. They see the pattern for what it is. They recognize that no amount of love can heal someone who is determined to stay emotionally closed. They accept that they cannot pour endlessly into a relationship where their emotional needs are treated as inconveniences. So they choose peace, even if that peace requires letting go of someone they love. And because their heart is genuine, their departure is not vindictive, it is an act of self-preservation, the avoidant may interpret this calm exit as detachment or indifference, but it is the opposite. The empath's quiet departure holds deep emotion, just not the emotion the avoidant expects. There is sadness, yes, there is disappointment, but there is also a profound sense of liberation. The empath finally understands that they cannot carry both sides of the relationship. They cannot be the glue that holds everything together while the other person refuses to show up. And in recognizing this truth, they make a decision rooted in strength rather than hurt. As the empath leaves, they don't hope the avoidant suffers or regrets their choices. Their focus shifts inward. They begin to rediscover themselves, who they were before the emotional imbalance, before the exhaustion, before they were forced to settle for crumbs of affection. They reconnect with their desires, their confidence, and their inner peace. They remember that they deserve a love that meets them with equal effort and emotional presence. Their walkaway becomes the turning point not just in the relationship, but in their own healing. And while the avoidant may believe the empath is giving up, the truth is far more powerful. The empath is choosing to stop abandoning themselves. Their goodbye is the beginning of a new chapter, one written with self-worth, boundaries, and the knowledge that real love should never require them to diminish the best parts of who they are. When the super empath finally walks away, the avoidant often experiences an emotional awakening that they never expected and certainly never prepared for. For so long, the avoidant has survived relationships by minimizing their emotional investment. They keep things surface level, they distance themselves when intimacy grows, and they convince themselves that feelings are dangerous. This pattern becomes their comfort zone, and because the empath has always been, and they're patient, encouraging, emotionally available, the avoidant never feels the true consequences of their own distance. They assume there will always be another chance, another reassurance, another moment where the empath softens and pulls them close again. But when the empath leaves, this illusion shatters. The absence of the empath doesn't just create space, it exposes the emotional reality the avoidant has been avoiding. For the first time, they cannot hide behind excuses like, "I don't need anyone," or "I'm better off alone." The silence forces them to sit with the weight of their choices. They begin to feel emotions they once pushed away: regret, longing, fear, confusion. At first, they may not even recognize what they're feeling, because avoidants are experts at numbing. But slowly, the emotional numbness cracks. They notice the emptiness where comfort used to be. They miss the messages they assumed would always come. They miss the emotional warmth that once made vulnerability feel less terrifying. This awakening doesn't come from the empath trying to teach them a lesson. It comes from the empath no longer cushioning the avoidant's fear. When the empath leaves, the avoidant can't rely on someone else to make the relationship safe. They have to confront their own emotional patterns, and that confrontation is deeply uncomfortable. For maybe the first time, they realize that love requires more than passive presence. It requires risk. It requires effort. It requires being seen. And the person they once pushed away was the one person who was always willing to meet them in that vulnerable space. Loss becomes the mirror the avoidant cannot escape. They see their behaviors reflected back at them, not through criticism, but through absence. They recognize that their fear of getting hurt didn't protect them after all. It cost them someone who offered steady love, someone who gave grace, someone who understood them in ways they struggled to understand themselves. This realization often triggers a kind of emotional unraveling. The avoidant begins questioning their own patterns. Why couldn't they let themselves receive love? Why did they run from a relationship that was safe? Why did they push away the one person who meant the most? The awakening is painful, not because the empath wanted them to feel pain, but because the avoidant is finally feeling everything they suppressed. They start replaying moments where the empath reached out, where the empath was patient, where the empath tried to connect. And for the first time, they see those moments not as pressure, but as effort. Effort they never reciprocated. This realization can create a deep internal conflict. On one hand, the avoidant wants to reach out. On the other, they feel unworthy or afraid of being rejected. But the difference now is that they actually care about the outcome. They realize that indifference was never the truth. It was a shield. The avoidance awakening happens after the empath leaves because absence exposes what presence could not. As long as the empath stayed, the avoidant could cling to the illusion that love was always within reach, even if they didn't show up for it. But once the empath walks away, the avoidant is forced to confront the truth. Emotional distance has a cost, and the price is always paid in moments of irreversible loss. And while this awakening may come too late to repair the relationship, it becomes the first step in breaking the patterns that kept them disconnected in the first place. When the super empath finally walks away, two emotional journeys begin, one of healing and one of awakening, and they unfold in opposite directions, at opposite speeds, and for opposite reasons. The empath's healing begins the very moment they choose themselves. For so long, they have carried the emotional weight of the relationship. They have been the one who forgave first, tried hardest, communicated most clearly, and held the connection together when their partner pulled away. Walking away is painful, but it is also liberating. It is the first breath of peace they've felt in a long time. Their inner world, once tangled in confusion and hope, begins to untangle itself. They start to feel the return of their energy, their clarity, their sense of who they are outside the emotional imbalance. The empath heals not because the avoidant changes, but because the empath finally stops abandoning themselves. Meanwhile, on the other side, the avoidance awakening begins only after the empath's energy is gone. While the empath spent the relationship feeling too much, the avoidant spent it feeling too little. They suppressed, deflected, minimized, and rationalized their emotional distance. But when the empath leaves, emotional absence becomes a mirror. It shows the avoidant what presence once felt like. It reveals how deeply the empath filled their emotional gaps, and it exposes a truth they often ignore. The connection mattered far more than they allowed themselves to believe. The avoidant begins to feel what the empath felt all along, not because they suddenly changed, but because the loss removed the emotional buffer that once kept them comfortable. Without the empath's steady love, the avoidant can no longer hide from their own heart. These emotional journeys never unfold in sync. The empath moves toward peace, while the avoidant moves toward realization. The empath begins to rebuild themselves, gaining strength from the clarity they once lacked. They rediscover their identity, their boundaries, and their capacity to love without self-sacrifice. They learn that love should be reciprocal, not one-sided, nourishing, not draining. And as they move forward, the avoidant starts looking backward. The very moments the avoidant once dismissed now return as memories filled with meaning. They remember the softness of the empath's care, the patience in their voice, the consistency of their support. Regret begins to form, not because the empath punished them, but because the avoidant finally sees the depth of what they lost. The contrast between the two journeys is stark. The empath is shedding emotional weight while the avoidant is picking it up. The empath is learning freedom while the avoidant is learning loss. And ironically, the avoidant begins to desire the very closeness they once feared. This shift often comes too late, not because the empath is unkind, but because they have grown beyond the version of themselves that overgave. As they heal, they develop new standards for what they allow in their life. They understand that mutual effort is non-negotiable, that emotional availability is essential, and that love should not feel like a constant pursuit. Their healing requires letting go fully, not waiting for the avoidant to wake up. For the avoidant, the awakening is necessary, even if it is painful. It is the first step toward breaking the emotional patterns that kept them distant and disconnected. They finally understand that vulnerability is not a threat, but a pathway, that intimacy is not confinement, but connection. And while they awaken through loss, the lesson becomes a catalyst for their growth. Two journeys begin at the moment of separation, but only one leads to immediate peace. The empath's healing is the reward for choosing themselves. The avoidance awakening is the consequence of realizing too late how much they needed the very person they pushed away. In the end, when a super empath walks away, it becomes the turning point where both hearts finally face the truth, one stepping into healing, the other confronting what fear once hid. It is a reminder that love cannot thrive without reciprocity, vulnerability, and emotional presence, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing yourself, even when your heart still cares. Thank you all for listening, for holding space for this message, and for honoring the strength it takes to walk away from what diminishes you, and walk toward the love and peace you truly deserve.